Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this video I want to do an in-depth analysis of the new movie Joker. In case it's not already obvious, that means there is going to be a ton of spoilers in this video. So if you haven't already seen Joker and you don't want anything spoiled, you're probably best just to shut this video off right now, go away, watch the film, and then come back later and watch this video after you've actually seen the movie. You have been warned. From here on out, spoilers, and lots of them are going to be possible. So where to start? I think for me, in a nutshell, this was a phenomenal film. The cinematography is amazing. I really loved the color palette that they chose, a lot of the angles, camera angles. You'll notice early on there was sort of what is, sometimes referred to as the Dutch angle, but even not so much Dutch angles, but just angles where the camera itself was slightly skewed. And what it does is it creates that sense of unease, that something's not right here. And there's lots of low angles as well, looking up at things. And it creates a sense of menace, the sense of uncertainty, the sense of confusion. And it really is so much of what's going on. It's helping to build a sort of visual tension. I love the look of the film. It looks good. The score was amazing. There's these moments where you have the musical scoring start to build a tension, and then the music just disappears. And the natural tension of what's happening on screen, the acting, the script, the director allows that to actually build the tension. We'll talk more about that a bit later on, because there's some really amazing scenes where there's this, it's quite intense. You're not sure what's going to happen. And there's none of the usual sort of what you might call movie trickery, particularly the use of scoring or sound to try and create tension. It's just all in the performance and in what's happening on screen. And it really is quite amazing. That's a sign, I think, of a good script and some really good directing. But the score itself in this was amazing. And also the use of various songs, the way in which songs were used in this movie, I think they were excellent. They were just perfect. And they added a whole other dimension to it. I've seen other films. I think of, I'm just trying to think, probably the Suicide Squad was an example of this, where they used songs in a way that just felt like the musical equivalent of product placement. There was no sense of sort of artistic merit. It was just like, put a song in here and we'll have a musical montage type moment. There's none of that in this film. Everything really lends itself and is put at service of the story, I think. Joaquin Phoenix was unbelievable. It's like he threw himself into this role. You can see this. The way he transformed his own body with the amount of weight he lost is phenomenal enough in and of itself. But his performance in this film is just like, people have said, oh, Joaquin Phoenix carries it and this wouldn't be a good film without him. Yeah, sure, but that's true of just about any film that is a great film. The reason it's a great film is because everything comes together. And in this film, I think everything comes together. And in particular, you can't have a great film without a great lead actor. And in this case, that's what they had. So I don't think it's fair at all to say that this entire film is somehow different than other previous great films that we've seen in the history of cinema. And just because Joaquin Phoenix was amazing and he carried this film, of course he did. He really had to. And if you had a lesser actor in that part, then it wouldn't be a great film. But that's true of every great film. So that's not a demerit in relation to this film at all. But he was unbelievable. His acting is phenomenal. He really pulls you in. You watch him intently whenever he's on screen. There's just so much. His eyes, his mannerisms, this is a man who threw himself into this role, and I think who has clearly tried to understand perhaps what it might be like to be someone who was isolated by, in this case, not just mental illness, but by the social awkwardness that he carries around with him and other things like that. And it just, like, if you had, like a Jack Nicholson, for example, doing this, I think of his version of the Joker. It's more comical, and it's sort of the comical villainous type character that wouldn't have worked if you had someone doing it that way. If you had someone playing him in a more sinister way, what we might, like the Heath Ledger type version of the Joker, that wouldn't have worked. This is a very different version of who the Joker is because it gives his backstory. And what Joaquin Phoenix does so well is he pulls us, the audience, into that journey, and you really feel for this guy. This is a film that's sort of almost answering the question, well, if the Joker was a real person, what would their backstory actually most likely be like? What would it really look like? And Joaquin Phoenix pulls you into that. And you have the sense of sympathy, and you can understand, even if you don't agree and you don't support the violence, which I don't think any of us should if we're good and virtuous people, that the character, where his life sort of culminates, you can understand the factors that drive him towards that. You can understand the conditions that alienate and isolate this man, and the sort of the final crescendo of how that all unfolds and breaks down in a very antisocial and truly horrific way. And that's Joaquin Phoenix. He pulls us into that. The writing was excellent, I thought, in this film. Now, I'm sort of surprised. I'm hearing some commentators complaining about the writing. I heard someone suggesting that they didn't really set certain things up. I find that complaint bizarre, because this is a film that really is, for want of another term, is almost 2 hours of setup. I had in my mind, I thought that they were going to perhaps spend an hour setting things up, and then the second hour was going to be the Joker, being the Joker. And there was going to be some caper, some plot, some criminal enterprise that he was going to involve himself in, and the second part of the film was going to be, him getting caught or something like that. I sort of had in my mind that maybe that's what they were going to do. We were going to see more of him as Joker, and sort of a 50-50 split between Arthur and Joker, but that's not what we get at all. This film avoids the temptation to do too much too quickly. They didn't do what a lot of other backstories are want to do, which is just rush through the backstory so they can get you into some sort of plot, action plot, or some sort of separate story where they are now that new character, so in this case the villain, the Joker. They don't do that, and I think that's really praiseworthy. And what it does is it makes things like that moment with the crescendo moment where he's on top of that vehicle and he paints his smile with the blood from his bruised and wounded mouth. There was something about that crescendo moment that really, it's just elevated by the fact that they didn't rush it. It's a very earned moment. And in cinema today, that is a very, very rare thing, because usually we get moments of that kind that are just not earned at all. And so the fact that they took their time and they really established, probably for the first time, I think, in a long time, an actual backstory. And they built a character and their motivations and who they are and why they are the way they are. Like, this to me is like the penultimate Joker lineage story, even if it maybe is all just a fever dream or a lie, as we've seen previously before. If you've read the graphic novel The Killing Joke, you'll know what I mean about the uncertainty around the Joker's, what is this really his origin story? Because it still could be, maybe this isn't his origin story, it's not true. But this, to me, regardless of that, I think this will always now be the pinnacle of what a backstory should look like for a villain. I mean, this has set a standard, I believe. It's really good. So people complaining they didn't really set things up, I think maybe they should go back and watch the film a second time, and that maybe there's things they missed the first time around, because I really do think that they did actually take their time. That's one thing you can't complain about this film, really, I think, is that, they didn't take their time or they didn't set things up. The whole film really is about setting up this character. One thing I know some people, even people who are favourable towards the film, didn't like was the setup with when the twist moment happens with the neighbour. And I know some people, I heard one or two commentators saying that they felt that it was a little bit too much like, they told us the twist, and then they sort of kept hammering home that point that it was a twist, and they felt like, we already got that. You didn't need to repeat the sort of the motif, which is telling us, hey, this isn't real, the relationship isn't real. But to be honest with you, I didn't feel that was overdone at all. I felt it made perfect sense, and it just made it really clear to the audience what was going on. And I don't I don't know, I don't feel there was anything that was that unusual or that disappointing about the way in which the reveal of the twist was executed for my mind. Look, the writing in this film I think was great. And I think it sort of in some ways it gives me a bit of hope, because I was someone who, and if you've been following my channel, you'll know this, one of my great disappointments with modern cinema, and it seems to be a more and more sort of recurring theme here, is the lack of authentic mythology, and so much of that is about writing, and you just don't get good, deep writing anymore. And what's amazing is this is remember, a comic book universe. I think possibly that's why this film got greenlit. I think if this film had been tweaked slightly and had nothing to do with the character of the Joker, I don't know whether it would have got greenlit in the current studio system. But because it's a comic book movie, I think there was perhaps more of an openness to allowing this particular film to be made, because you just don't see anymore this type of filmmaking, or certainly not in out of the mainstream studio system. And I think that's a great shame, and it's a real detriment to modern cinema and modern storytelling. It's just been consumed by other concerns, usually around financial utilitarianism. How much money can we make? Will it make money? Does it apply? Does a particular formula apply? If it doesn't, then no, we're not going to green light it. And this film got made in that sort of environment where that is the norm. And to me, that's quite amazing. It is, the writing of this film, the character development, the execution, everything about it is great. Another thing that I think is really phenomenal about this film is there's no cheap politics. There's no doubt there are allusions to things in this film, and there's things that you can see here. There's a sense of commentary going on here, but it's not cheap political point scoring. It focuses on deeper human themes. And that's what makes this film so universal. And this is why this film will stand the test of time, whereas other films that have gone the cheap political route, they won't last. There's a great line in this movie where his social worker, she says to him at one point, basically, and this is a transliteration of what she says, they don't care about me and they don't care about you. And you could read that clearly as very much a part of the script and what's going on in that particular point in the story. They're about to cut funding. He's not going to be able to get his medication. You can also see the political implications in that situation, because he has a black female social worker, and that black female social worker is talking to this mentally ill white male. This white male outcast, and she's saying they don't care about you and they don't care about me. And what she's doing there, and what I think this is a very subtle, but I like it because I think it's very accurate. It's reframing the political narrative, if you like, in a much deeper kind of way. So at the moment, the political narrative tends to be framed around these sort of very reductionist and totally inadequate identity politics markers. What's your skin color, what's your sexual orientation, and they sort of group people into identity markers, and then they try and accrue, if you like, for want of a better term, victim points or victimhood status points to people, depending on how many markers, the privilege points basically. And at the top of the heap, according to that view of the world, which, as I said, is totally inadequate and totally reductionist, is this idea that the white male is the top, the white heterosexual male is the top of the heap. It's an absurd way of looking at the world, because it's just not true. And this film really puts that into context. And I think it's important. And what it's doing is it's reframing it to get people to realise that in actual fact, it's not about things like skin colour, although these things can be a factor. There's no doubt about that in social issues. But you can't look at everything through that simplistic. It's just so childish that it is not an accurate and helpful way. It's not truthful. And so what you see in this film is that in actual fact, that regardless of skin colour, what you really have is a world where people have privilege by virtue of the power and the wealth that they have. And that's true in our world as well, just as much as it is in this version of Gotham. It is those who have the financial means are the ones who really have the privilege. Think about someone like O.J. Simpson or Jussie Smollett. These are people who don't fit into that reductionist identity politics view of what a victim should look like, or what someone with power and privilege should look like, but they absolutely do. And the reason that they have that privilege is because they are in a position of, celebrity, wealth, fame, and that gives them that sense of privilege. And it gives them that advantage in society that someone like, say in the case of this movie, for example, someone like Arthur doesn't have, despite the fact that he doesn't fit that sort of identity politics mold. And I think it was so good. And as I said, because this doesn't focus on cheap political point scoring, what it's not trying to do is it's not trying to say to you, well, look, our tribe is better than their tribe, or here's why their tribe is so vile and awful. This is not political activism. This is actually the kind of political exploration that I think we need more of in cinema. It's looking deeper at, because basically, in a nutshell, politics is always downstream from culture. And what you've got to start with then is these big questions around the human person and human flourishing. What contributes to that and what diminishes that? What is positive towards that? What is negative and harmful to that? And this film is trying to do that. And then what that does is that gives you a context to analyse your politics with. You don't start with politics. You don't start there, and this film doesn't do that. And it's really analysing those deeper conditions, and I think that's what makes this such a great film. Now, as other commentators have pointed out, there are some key themes that this movie touches on in a bit more of a bigger way. I think the three that really stood out for me was the theme around the cult of celebrity and the role of the media in the world. I was somewhere recently and someone was talking about a book they were reading about Silicon Valley and social media, and they were referring to something the author had talked about, how social media today is really about a race to the bottom of the brainstem, to the most animalistic part of the brain, and it's just you want people to act on pure instinct and to be clicking based solely on instinct. And you don't want to worry about virtue and control and other things like that because you just want the clicks. And I think that is true of social media today. So this commentary that's in this film about media and cult of celebrity is probably more prescient than it's ever been before, thanks to a lot of the new technologies which allow us to broadcast ourselves instantly all over the globe in a way that is cheap and easy and that we've never ever had access to before. And so the race to the bottom of the brainstem, if you like, is very much, I think, a theme in this film, and it's really prescient. Obviously the character of Murray Franklin and his show, and also not just that, but the news media and this constant fear-mongering and scaremongering that's there. That part of it's a little bit more subtle. I want to talk about the subtlety of this film in a minute, but that part of it might be a little bit more subtle. But, there's one news report, I think it's towards the beginning, where they're talking about, giant rats. And these aren't just regular rats, these are like mega rats. The first thing I thought of when I heard that, because clearly it's amping up the fear factor. And the first thing I thought of was the extremes of sort of the apocalyptic environmental alarmism, which is now so much a part of our news cycle today. This isn't just a changing climate. This is so extreme that if we don't act now, we'll all be gone in 18 months. So that sort of unfounded alarmist rhetoric that just so much dominates our culture now in our news cycle. And so many people are so fearful of that. The absurdity of what this is producing and driving is it's kind of frightening in some ways when you think about it. People who are now too scared to have children because they believe that having children is somehow an awful and immoral act because they're so fearful of what the environmental conditions are now and are going to be. And there's something about that that's very much, it's subtle, because they're not reporting on climate change or anything like that in this film, but you see that same type of scaremongering for sure in the media today and in this film, but it's just played out in other ways. And of course, the whole cult of celebrity. Arthur is desperate to become famous because he thinks that is where he will find himself. It really is quite important, that idea. He becomes distorted by this cult of celebrity. It's not something that seems obvious at first, but when you think about it, that's something that actually drives his descent into villainy. Secondly is obviously the theme of mental illness. Now that is a big theme. And I know some people, I've already seen one or two bits of commentary floating around suggesting that this film is bad because it makes out that people with mental illness will just become violent psychopaths. I don't think that that's a fair reading of this film at all. I really don't. And I say that as someone who, two important things in my own history, I experienced my own serious battle with, it was a brief in the history of my life, but it was a year or two of anxiety and depression that I sort of battled with about 17 years ago. Secondly, and more importantly, my own father suffered from schizophrenia for most of his adult life. And so I've seen this kind of mental illness that is portrayed in this film. I've seen this type of mental illness up close and personal. And not once did I think to myself, oh, this film is ridiculing people like my father or making out that people like my father will become violent psychopaths. If you've ever lived with that kind of mental illness, like I have, then you will know that in actual fact, this film, I think, actually opens a window and a doorway for people who perhaps have never experienced that kind of mental illness to perhaps understand with more sympathy the kind of things that fuel and which drive that. The fact that my father was married and remained married to one woman until he died last year, and that he had 6 kids. Like, as a schizophrenic, that's a pretty amazing feat, because most people who suffer from schizophrenia are very much their lives would parallel a lot of what we saw in the life of Arthur in this film. This sort of isolation. They're alone. Perhaps they're relying on an older parent to sort of to shelter and to nurture them. The system often doesn't really understand them. It's certainly true not just in America, but around the world. The way in which mental health services are not as they should be, and also social isolation. We'll talk more about that in a minute, because I think this is one of the other big things. And the third thing that really I think this film touches on is the loss of community. And I want to come back and talk about that, because I think that for me is why I think this film is so important. When I view this film as a sort of metaphor, if you like, for the current state of the West, and I think it's a pretty good one, then I think this film is a very important prophetic warning. It has an element of prophecy to it, where it's sort of foretelling. It is saying, hey, look, the loss of community is so great, and this is not something we've ever had before in our society. It's broken down to the degree where there are some very, very serious ramifications for what happens, and a lot of evil and social harm is being driven by that loss of community. I want to come back and talk about that, because I think it's such an important point. Before I do that, though, there's some random specific things that I just wanted to touch on, and sort of, there's no sort of coherent narrative about the next part of this video, but I just wanted to sort of highlight different things that sort of really stuck out for me in the movie, and I wanted to comment on. So first of all, I love that scene with the rain, where he is washed by the rain after he visits the asylum and discovers a bit more about his own history. And there's something about that that's very baptismal imagery that you are seeing there. This idea of being washed or cleansed from something, going from your old life to a new life. And it is a moment, it's a break, it's a point of, it really is a point in his life where he is now transitioning from one place to another. And it's interesting, you'll notice throughout most of the film that he has, just about in every scene, you'll see around the bottom of his jawline the sort of the remainder of the white clown makeup. It's always on his face. It's always there. And that clown makeup, when you think about it, is a visual and tangible symbol of his former life, where he's with his mother, he's doing the clowning thing. He's not this criminal mastermind, this major criminal villain. And what happens, though, is after he visits the asylum and he reads the full truth about his mother and about his history and everything else, he comes back from that and he is washed in the rain. This is a moment of the old lies, or the old story is being washed away, and now there is a new story which is starting to form. And it really struck me, the visual symbolism of that. I thought that was just a great use of that, because all of a sudden you get rain in the story, and the way that it's used is just pitch perfect. I love that comedy club scene where he's taking notes, and desperately he wants to be a stand-up comedian. Part of that whole cult of celebrity thing I talked about earlier. He wants to be famous, and so he's copying other comedians because he thinks, this is how he will make his way in the world if he takes notes from others and learns from them. But what's interesting about that scene is he's laughing out of sync with the rest of the people in that room. He's either a beat behind or a beat ahead of where he should be with his laughter. He's either laughing too early at things that aren't really jokes, or he's laughing too late. And that was such, again, the symbolism. It's so simple, but it's very powerful symbolism and very obvious symbolism that allows you to realize and connect with the fact that he is not in sync with the rest of society. This is a man who is not sitting in what you might call the mainstream. He's on the fringes. And the fact that he laughs out of time with the rest of society is a very powerful and simple piece of symbolism to show you that and to point you to that important truth about his character. Like I said, the writing in this is really good, because that scene, it's just a random comedian who has no other major part in this film, who's not a major player, who's up on stage, a group of people around Arthur in that comedy club who are really irrelevant. They're only there because they're in that particular setting. And it's all about him and his reaction. And it's such a powerful moment. I know some commentators have raised frustrations or concerns, or they were perhaps a bit disappointed with the killing of Thomas and Martha Wayne. I'm okay with that. To me, I thought it was done well. I don't know if it was sort of 100% necessary to have it in the film, but I'll come back to it in a minute, because in another way I think it might have been. If I'm right in my assumption about what the conclusion of the film means, and this is a great film because there's ambiguity here, and I love the ambiguity, because that just allows for that sort of that creative interpretation on the part of us, the viewers. But I think the fact that they put it in, I'm okay with it. And it does still make sense. It doesn't distort, I think, in any way the whole Batman backstory and history and who Bruce Wayne is and what happened. It's still very, very possible, because you look at this guy who's wearing the clown mask and he's got a gun. Clearly this guy's a criminal. He's not a political activist. He's not. It's so well set up. And there's little subtle things that you probably didn't necessarily notice first time, but are kind of important, that actually contribute to the fact that that moment is not inconsistent with the history or the backstory of Batman and everything else we know about the Batman mythology. So first of all, the guy is clearly not, the guy's got the gun who's standing outside the theatre, who follows them down the alleyway and does the killing. He's clearly not a political activist. He's standing there watching other people who are doing the rioting and who are engaged in the political activism. So he's not part of that group. And he's wearing a green jacket, and he's got a gun in that jacket. So everything there indicates that this guy is actually just a criminal. And then he sees Thomas and Martha leave, and what does he do? He follows them, because this is his chance to, under the cover of this riot, to actually commit a criminal act and do a bit of theft. And of course he grabs at the pearls as the killing is taking place. And I think it was, to me, I don't have an issue at all with that. I thought that was actually executed quite well. And it leaves that whole ambiguity again, that whole thing of the fact that Bruce was a child, and did he remember that the killing of his parents as accurately as he could have? They got the essentials right. They're leaving the film. They're outside the theatre. They're in a back alley when it happens, and I don't really have a problem with that at all. The thing I did have a problem with, though, and I found a little bit frustrating, was the portrayal of Thomas Wayne. It's an artistic choice. It's not a major thing for me, but I didn't like this particular portrayal. I understand why they did it, but I felt there was possibly a better way of doing this, where you could still pit Arthur against Thomas Wayne without turning Thomas Wayne into this really awful, condescending elitist who looks down his nose at everyone else. Because my understanding of the Batman mythology is that I've never understood Thomas Wayne to be that type of character. I always understood him as being the type of character who was a genuinely good person and who wanted to do good for Gotham and wanted to see Gotham's social issues addressed in a positive way. And that very much that feeds who Bruce Wayne is and as he becomes Batman, etc. And so this portrayal of Thomas Wayne as this sort of arrogant, rich, elitist whose capitalism is king, and I just, to me, it felt I didn't like that. And that's a subjective thing, because artistically I understand why they did it. I feel they could have built that the relationship, or the more particularly the dysfunctional relationship between Arthur and Thomas without that, but that was the decision that was made. And that for me was one thing I found a little bit frustrating, because I think it particularly the impact of their death at the end, where they are killed in that alleyway, in some ways it takes something away from it, because it almost creates a sense of, well, maybe he did deserve it. No, I don't think anyone ever deserves to be murdered, even if they're an elitist and they're condescending and they don't care about the poor and vulnerable in their community. I'm not some sort of weird reactionary revolutionary. I don't believe that at all is ever acceptable. But you can certainly understand how, looking at that plot, you can think, oh, well, he didn't help himself, if you like, by his own conduct. He made him a target for that kind of criminal act. And that violence being perpetrated against him. And I feel that I really think the impact of the death should have been greater than that. The sort of the sense of the innocence that was being lost here by what was going on. It would have been greater if Thomas Wayne had not been portrayed as someone who was on the wrong side of the moral equation, who wasn't actually viewing Gotham through the eyes of someone genuinely caring and compassionate about those who are vulnerable and who were in need. As mentioned previously, I really loved the way that tension is written into some of the scenes in this film. Usually in the sort of the modern cinema context, when you want tension, it's done, they use the lowest common denominator possible to try and create tension. You amp up the tense music, you start shaking the camera, quick cuts back and forth. It's all, it's everything is designed to sort of viscerally amp you into the tension. It's almost like you have to be hit over the head. It's very unsubtle. But this film doesn't do that. And there are some scenes in here. So like that scene where he's standing outside the Wayne mansion with young Bruce Wayne, that there was so much tension in that scene. And you're thinking, man, what the heck is going to go on here? And you know already the story. You know that that's Batman, so clearly he's not going to get killed. But the way this scene plays out, it's loaded with tension. It's because of how the character has been written, the build-up to that moment, and the way Joaquin Phoenix has really embodied what is written in that script. It all comes together. Another great moment is the scene in the apartment after he has killed Randall, and Gary is there, and Gary wants to leave, and you remember thinking to yourself, I remember before he even got to the doorway, I remember thinking, first of all, he's got to get past Arthur now. Is Arthur going to just grab him and do violence to him? And then once he gets past him, you realise he can't reach the snib lock to unlock the door and get out. And at that point, I thought, oh no, and I heard someone in the theatre, I think a seat over from me, go, oh no. Like everyone in this theatre, you could feel the tension in this room. But there's no music. There's nothing, there's no gimmickry to try and trick you into this tension. It's just all loaded into the writing and to the portrayal of this character and what's come before and what's happening right now. And you start to think to yourself, I don't know what's going to happen here. Anything could happen. I don't think it's going to be good. And when he gets up and lets him out, it's like, oh man, it was like a huge tension release when he let him out and he says, you were always good to me, Gary, and he lets him go. But the tension in that scene was phenomenal, and it's all written. It's all about the scripting and the build-up. It's not unearned. It's so well earned, and it's not about those cheap, visceral sort of tricks. There were things I really liked about the film in relation to the subtlety. There's these various moments. In fact, the more I think about this film, the more I see lots of these little moments of subtlety in this movie. And there's some big questions here still floating around at the end of this film. And I like that about a movie. This is not trying to hit you over the head with really unsubtle and sort of paint by numbers, blatantly obvious. Let's just tell you every single thing and we'll explain it in triplicate so that you can walk away with absolutely no uncertainty. We'll fill in every possible blank. This film doesn't do that. It focuses on what's important and it leaves an element of mystery. And I think all good mythology and all good storytelling does that. It leaves you to begin to interpret. And I think interpretation and mystery is important because it allows us to contemplate a mythology more deeply. If it's just a very obvious paint by numbers and very simplistic way of doing it, there is nothing really for you to contemplate. You don't have to think more that deeply about something. You're being spoon-fed something. And this film isn't spoon-feeding you, and I think that's a really good thing. And so I think it allows us that space for contemplation, which is important. So, for example, did he kill his neighbours? We don't know, right? There's no indication in the film that he didn't. But I'm guessing he didn't, because I think the moment with Randall, that moment where he kills Randall, was to me that was a crescendo moment. That was where he just unleashes. I felt like anyway. So and it sort of points to the fact to me anyway that maybe he didn't, but we don't know for certain. It's possible that he did kill them, and they just chose not to show us that. Did he kill his therapist at the end of the film? He certainly appears to have done violence to her, and I'm assuming that it was fatal, because as he leaves, there are those bloody footprints as he's walking down that pristine white sort of corridor. And by the way, that was such a great visual. It's for lots of reasons. It was almost dreamlike, and in many ways you could say that is in and of itself is a sort of commentary about what you've just seen. How much of this was real? How much of this is his imagining? It's this sort of white, pristine, almost looks like heaven type environment, which is interesting because compared to where he was in the city and in the society, I'll talk more about that in a moment, it was gritty, it was dark, it was almost like hell. It's grey, it's dirty, it's rat-infested. This place looks, positively clean and sparkling, like, wow, this is a much better home, a much better place for someone to be. It's almost like he's found his home in the asylum. And he's sort of finally fully embraced who he is. But leaving that aside, he's walking down that aisle, there's those bloody footprints that you see. Did he kill his therapist at the end of the film? What is the joke at the end of the film where he is laughing and he says to his therapist in the asylum, he says, don't worry, you wouldn't get the joke. What is the joke he's referring to? Has he just told a lie? Is this whole thing a deception? It's not really his backstory, because that certainly is consistent with the mythology of who Joker is. Here's my personal take on this. I actually think that moment is probably the most important crescendo moment of the film. I think the joke here is it's several things all sort of playing out at once. So first of all, when he comes to the end of that sort of there's that visual montage and then right after that, he's sort of laughing away and he says, don't worry, you wouldn't get the joke. And it's the first time, by the way, we actually see him and hear him laughing. He's actually genuinely laughing. It's not fake. It's not his brain injury causing him to have that tic. It's actually genuine laughter. He's actually laughing. It's sincere. So it is quite an important laugh in that moment. But you remember the last visual we see is, before that, is Bruce Wayne there with his two dead parents. Now, my sense is that the joke here is that the Joker now knows that both him and Bruce, they're on an equal footing now. They are both orphans now. They're both on an equal footing. And I think for me in that scene, he actually only really fully becomes the Joker in that moment, at the very end of that movie. It's not on the late night TV show. That's not where, I think he becomes the Joker. It's not when he's dancing on the car. I still don't think that's where he's become the Joker. I think he's definitely the metamorphosis is sort of almost complete, but I don't think that's where it is. I think it's actually in that asylum. That's where he fully embraces and becomes the Joker with absolute total abandonment. Why do I say that? Well, because he makes that comment about, don't worry, you wouldn't get the joke. And my sense is that, him and Bruce Wayne are now orphans. What he's done here is I think he's realizing that the richest and most powerful, or one of the most powerful men in Gotham, who was running for mayor, has been brought down by him, the most insignificant man in Gotham. And I think there's something about that. He's realizing the power that he wields. He also, I think, is embracing his nihilism. He just leans right into it. There's hints of nihilism before. Like when he's on the talk show, he talks about it, he doesn't believe anything, but then he goes on, and actually clearly he does have a motivation, and it's not political in nature, but he does believe in something, and he's talking about these things that motivate him. So it's not nihilism that motivates him at all, but by the end of it, I think he's embraced nihilism in that asylum. And what's happened, I think, is he realizes I've killed the parents of, or my actions have resulted in the death of the richest and one of the most powerful men in Gotham, and I'm the most lowly and insignificant. And it's not just him who is the target of my ire and my rage, but it's also his son Bruce. In many ways, Bruce really is the target here, because Bruce has what Arthur wants. Bruce is with his dad. Bruce is living a good life. He has all the things that Arthur wants. And so really, when you think about it, Bruce is the target of his rage. It's not really Thomas. It's actually Bruce. But the joke, of course, is that his actions have resulted in the killing of Bruce's parents. And now him and Bruce are on this equal footing. But what has it really achieved? Nothing. He's here in an asylum where, as far as he's aware, he's going to spend the rest of his days. And Bruce is still out there in the mansion, in the position of power and privilege. So it's like the whole thing it's just a joke. It's, what have I actually done? What have my actions actually done? And I think this is the point at which he embraces the nihilism, because he laughs, and it's a real laugh for the first time. And what does he do then? He proceeds to kill his therapist, or certainly do serious physical harm to her in that hospital. And to me, this is the sense of, and you get this as he's walking down that corridor, he is now a completely different person. He's no longer Arthur. That has been cast aside. He has now become something else. And this whole idea of the visual interpretation of that scene, where this room almost looks like heaven. It's like this is home to him. This is his pristine mansion. You see, this is the place where he thinks he's supposed to be. And I think that's what's going on in that final moment of the scene of the film, that final scene. But hey, I could be completely wrong, and that's the beauty of this film, is there's just so much room for interpretation. Now, the last question that I have before I wrap this all up, the last ambiguity is, was he actually Thomas Wayne's illegitimate son? Now, I know some people are assuming that that was all just a lie, that he's not Thomas Wayne's illegitimate son at all. But I think that that's still ambiguous. I still think there's enough ambiguity and uncertainty there where that question was never definitively answered, certainly not in a way I ever saw. In fact, towards the end of the film, what has he got? He's got a photograph of his mother as a young woman, and on the back is written that little message. And I think some commentators that I've noted or watched commentary or read commentary seem to have missed that scene, where there's the on the back of the photograph of his mother as a young woman is that little message that says something like, I really love your smile, and it's got TW, Thomas Wayne, as the initials. Now, whoever wrote that note, that's the key to resolving that mystery. Because if that was written by Thomas Wayne, then yeah, Arthur is actually an illegitimate son of the Wayne Empire. If it's written by mother in a state of delusion, so she's delusional and she writes this, which is also conceivable, then he's not. The whole thing really is a delusion. It was a fantasy. She did actually adopt him. My take was, I'm leaning towards the fact that this film is trying to say that Arthur was actually an illegitimate son of Wayne. Everyone's assuming that she was the one with the issue, but what if she's driven to that psychotic break? What if it's the fact that they fabricate this lie, and they're rich and powerful enough to do this if they want to fabricate this lie that that she adopted Arthur, because that was the way of that was the socialites. And this is not at all inconceivable. Once upon a time, socialites would do this with their own children. They would send them away. If they had illegitimate children, they got pregnant, they would send them away to hide the pregnancy. The child would be delivered, and then you would have some story concocted. The child would either end up somewhere else, or maybe the child would come back into the family in another way. That was not an uncommon type of occurrence. And so it's quite conceivable that they've done exactly that. And this has driven her into a place of where she's had a psychotic break. And everything that she's done subsequently, including the harm that she has allowed to happen to Arthur, is because she is channeling her rage against him. It's Thomas Wayne has mistreated her, but she views Arthur as the thing. And this, honestly, by the way, from a psychological perspective, this makes so much sense. This is not at all uncommon for people to do. They channel rage into children because they view the children as depriving them, particularly females. This is not an uncommon thing when these situations arise to have happen, where females will view the children as costing them a relationship, or as a threat to a relationship that they have, when things become dysfunctional in that way. And in this situation, it is totally conceivable that that is what's happened here, that she has allowed this mistreatment because she views him or certainly when he was younger, as the cause of her loss and being deprived her chance to be around Thomas Wayne, to have the relationship and everything else. And so it's a big area of ambiguity. Now, some people I know, some commentators were like, I don't know if this makes much sense when you think about the mythology and the whole history of Batman. I think it would actually be very, very consistent, and very cleverly consistent, because now what you would have done, if this is true, but remember it's ambiguous, is you've set up a situation in which the Joker isn't just Batman's arch nemesis. That's always been that relationship, Joker and Batman. But it's also the fact that these two are now like they're half brothers, and they're two sides of the same coin. And from a mythology perspective, from a storytelling perspective, there is so much symbolism in that. It's Cain and Abel. Honestly, it really is. It's so loaded in a way that it adds a whole nother level of depth to the Batman mythology. So I think it's very, very consistent, and it would make a whole lot of sense of the Joker's absolute disdain for who Batman is, and why he is the sort of the primary target of his rage, and why they have such a strong nemesis hero type relationship. So I'm actually okay with that. But as I said, it's ambiguous. It could all be that the whole thing was a delusion, that she really did make this whole story up, and she lied about it. Just to wrap things up with, I think that this film, for me, is a companion movie to M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable. Why do I think it's a companion movie to Unbreakable? Well, first of all, it's an origin story, and I think it is now the best origin story of a villain, that's for sure. Unbreakable, I think, is the best origin story for a superhero that's ever been put to film, and I think this is the best origin story of a villain. I think there's also a lot of other similarities. There is, I would say there's almost an M. Night Shyamalan-esque type sensibility to this film. The use of cello in the musical score is one thing that sort of struck me. Some of the visuals, just some of the way this plays out. It very much, I could imagine M. Night Shyamalan making, or certainly big parts of this film, which is interesting to me. There's the key thing, though, as to why I think these two movies are companion movies is because they both are really dealing with the same subject matter. Two men who have callings, but those callings have become confused and distorted. But the difference is this. In Unbreakable, the character, David Dunn, moves in this direction, whereas in Joker, Arthur moves in a completely opposite direction. They go, they're polar opposites, the way things play out. But both men are struggling with the question of calling and vocation. Who am I in the world? Who am I supposed to be? So David Dunn his whole life is collapsing and falling to bits because he doesn't understand how to take the gift of his masculine strength and use it in the world. He's confused about his vocation, who he's supposed to be, and everything is unraveling as a result. But what he does is he discovers his true vocation, and then everything comes back together for him, and he really finds his flourishing. In this movie, Arthur starts out with a sense of who he's supposed to be, but his calling becomes distorted, and he actually he moves right away from human flourishing, and he actually unravels, and it is the undoing of him because his calling is distorted. Because you think about the character of Arthur in this movie, he's clearly got a real calling, and we keep hearing references to this. He talks about it, his mother told him that he was there to make people laugh. He understands something about himself that I believe is absolutely true. And you see this reinforced whenever you see him clowning. There's only one or two moments where we see him clowning, but when you see him in that hospital, when you see him with the sign, clearly this guy has got clowning chops. He's got clowning skills. He's actually bringing something of joy, positivity. He's bringing a bit of light to a dark world, and he's actually good at it. He's got the skills. But here's the thing. His calling has become distorted by the fact that he's living in a society which has convinced him that it's all about money and celebrity. So he's got to make money doing it, or he's got to be, really, more importantly for him, he's got to be famous, the cult of celebrity. He can't just fulfill that calling in the world. And so he thinks because he can't be famous doing this thing, that somehow, that this whole, he loses touch with what his calling, authentic calling is. And he moves right away from that calling to bring light into the world, and he embraces a lie. He embraces the lie at the very end that his job is to bring darkness and nihilism and confusion into the world. He's not supposed to be the clown who actually brightens people's day. He is supposed to be, basically, he's supposed to be like Satan, the great liar, the clown who mimics and mocks and ridicules everything that is good, true, and beautiful, to bring destruction and to bring about its downfall. And so I think these two films, they really are quite important companion movies in what they say about that and about calling and everything else. I think also that, I think for me this is most important of all, this film really is, when you view it as a metaphor for the current state of the West, it is a very important prophetic warning. Because the big theme here, I think, really, still for me, that really cuts through everything else, is the loss of community and the loss of virtue. There's a lack of virtue in this world, and community has broken down. He is a man who was isolated in a city of millions of people? The only other person he has any connection to in any sort of meaningful way really is his mother. He has a sort of community with his workmates, but even they don't really respect him. There's not authentic self-giving love present in this world. And this is very much the West right now. The West right now is very much marked by the breakdown of community. We have atomized people into just being autonomous, self-choosing individuals, and we have sold them this lie that that's what they're supposed to be. And both sides have failed. If you want to look at this in political terms, both sides of the political spectrum have failed here. They have failed. Absolutely, because what you tend to get is this false dichotomy that arises now where people think that, we've got to avoid the extremes of collectivism like communism, and that's true, we don't want that evil, but they think the way to avoid that evil is by embracing sort of this rampant autonomous individualism. You just elevate and separate the individual from everything else, and it becomes all about me and my choices and nothing more, and everyone should just allow me to make whatever choice I want to. I would suggest that's a false dichotomy, because it's not just the choice between one of those two options. Surely there's a third path that we can walk here where you respect legitimate individual human rights and freedoms, so that the legitimate freedoms and rights that should be afforded to every individual, but at the same time, it's always held in balance, and at times that tension can be difficult, I totally get that, but it's always held in balance with the fact that the individual is supposed to live out their life in community, and so you must balance the wants of the individual against also the good of the community. The two things must be held in tension. At times it will be in tension. And so both sides have failed. And so what you get is collectivism, and they say, no, it's all about the group, and the individual doesn't exist really except in relation to the group. The group's sort of more important, the collective and everything else. And so you get the evils of communism at sort of that end of the spectrum. And then at the other end, you get this rampant individualism, which says, no, that it's all about the individual, my body, my choice. And it's just destructive. Those things, both of those extremes, have destroyed authentic community, and they've done untold harm. And very much that is the world in which I think Arthur is living. Economics is not going to save him. More medication is not going to save him. Think about that. At the beginning of the film, when we meet him, he's not living the perfect life. And this is a really important point. It's not like he's got a good life, and then because of some economic factors, they start depriving him medication, which is what happens. And then all of a sudden, it all unravels from there. Some people are trying to create that as if that's the sort of the narrative here, that because he was deprived of his medication, that's what caused him to become what he is. I don't think that's really, I think that's far too simplistic, because at the start of the film, he's not living a good, functioning, happy, flourishing human experience. He's just not. He's unhappy, desperately unhappy. He has no meaning. He has no authentic vision for human flourishing. He doesn't even think his life matters. He does not believe that his life actually matters. And as his therapist says to him at the beginning, his social worker, he's on, 7 different medications already. Medication is not the issue here. It's something much deeper and more profound. He has no authentic community around him. He is not part of an authentic community. And that's very much the West today. So many people are disconnected and isolated precisely because they have no community. And without community, you can't find meaning. And that is why there is such a crisis of meaning and such a crisis of nihilism in the West. People have no sense of meaning, and that is the real crisis here, and that's where the film starts. And then what happens is, as he loses his medication, the fact that there's no community or anything around him only makes that problem worse and exacerbates it, and it culminates where it does. But if he had a loving, caring community around him, then a person like Arthur would actually have a sense of meaning in the world. He would understand his calling. I think about Arthur in the context of Christianity. And I think about a guy, because I've known a lot of guys just like him. And they've been in churches that I've been part of. And men like that, or women like that, they found themselves in those Christian communities. Because those Christian communities gave them a sense of meaning, and they wrapped around them with care and love. And they were able to take their difference and actually turn it into a strength. But in a society without community, a difference like the differences that Arthur is struggling with, they have become a weakness, a serious Achilles heel, and they will lead to his undoing. The problem, though, is not Arthur. The problem is the society in which he's living. That's the whole point. And that is very much us in the West. One of the popular talks that I am being asked to give, a presentation that I give in public, more and more now, all around the place, is a presentation I have on the loss of authentic community in the West, why it has happened, what are the sort of 6 or 7 major factors that that has created this perfect storm that has led to this problem, and more importantly, why we need to recover it and what we can do to recover it. And this is, like this talk, wherever I give this talk, you pack a room out. People know there's a problem. We keep trying to solve this problem as if it's nothing more than a pathology, just like with Arthur. If we give him more medication, he will think that his life is fine. He will realize it's all good. But like I say to people in my presentation on community, if you feel disconnected and isolated, you feel isolated and alone, there's a reason for that. It's probably because you are living a lifestyle that has disconnected you from others and has left you isolated and often alone. It's not simply a pathology. It's not simply a state of mental dysfunction that you're experiencing, and if we could just fix that and we could convince you to have different thoughts and you could start thinking, I'm actually fine, the world is great, I've got community, then all of a sudden your life would be fine. Now for some people that's true, but for a whole lot more people in the West today, that's not the problem. The problem is they are living in a society that has broken down. And I think the reason that a lot of people still don't realize that is because we've got enough money to actually bury ourselves in hedonism and hide from that fact that the West has collapsed. It's already collapsed, I think. But we've got enough money to keep pursuing hedonism, self-gratification, and that numbs us to the reality of it. But for more and more people, every day they are starting to realise something is not right. Even to the point where, like in my country now, our suicide rate is climbing again to the highest it's ever been. There's something desperately wrong here. And this film, I think, really points to that fact. That it's not medication that the Joker needs. It's not medication that a man like Arthur needs. It is a genuine community of human persons that can wrap around him with authentic self-giving love and care that he can be part of, and they can be part of his life, and that where he would truly find himself. And like I said, I've been in churches, Christian churches, where I have seen this very thing play out. And men like Arthur, women like Arthur have truly found themselves. And their quirks and their differences are accepted. They're not driven away to the fringes. They're accepted. And not only that, but those people have often found their calling because they've been freed up in this community to actually just live out their calling like Arthur would be. Like in a church, Arthur would be the guy who would be volunteering, even if he couldn't hold down a regular job. He would be the guy who would be volunteering in children's hospitals and children's youth groups and things like that, and holiday programs and all sorts of stuff, to be the clown. He would have a sense of meaning. He would have a sense of purpose. And you realise, when I watched this film, for me, I was almost in tears at the end of it because I see the great tragedy that this prophetic warning points to. The West is in trouble, and this film is a warning, a serious warning about the tragedy that is unfolded and what it means. I think of the characters like Arthur that I have known, and I think imagine those people without authentic community. The one last thing I'll say before finishing up is I don't think they should make a sequel. Already they're talking about it. I really don't think they should. I think they should just leave this film as a powerful testament, a powerful statement in and of its own right. Just leave it as is. Don't make a sequel. Leave it where it is. And I think what they will have done is they will have done something truly amazing in modern cinema, and they will have set a really high new bar for how good films can still be, what they should be, and certainly for how to tell a backstory about a character, particularly a villainous character. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like this content, please consider leaving a tip in the tip jar. There's a PayPal link below. Or if you can't find the link below, sometimes people say that link doesn't work for them. If you go to the home page of my channel, the main page, at the very top of the page, you'll find a button for PayPal. You can click on that, and that still seems to be working. You can make a contribution that way. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.